All right. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the man himself, one of the co-founders of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network and the author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Sympathizer, which is currently being adapted by HBO into a television series released this year. Its sequel, The Committed, the best-selling short story collection, The Refugees, and the children's book, Chicken of the Sea, excuse me, co-written with his son, Ellison. Please give Mr. Viet Thanh Nguyen a very warm welcome. Welcome back, Viet.
Well, it's fantastic to be back here on Accented, and also really great to be speaking with our guest today, Professor Yến Lê Espiritu, Distinguished Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego. We'll be talking about a topic that's really dear to my heart, refugees. And it's dear to my heart because I was or am a refugee. I came to the United States in 1975, along with 130,000 other Vietnamese refugees, and 22,000 of us ended up in Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. Interestingly enough, that was in 1975. In 1979, 19,000 Cuban refugees were housed in the very same barracks. So we'll be talking today about refugees, what happened to the Vietnamese, Cambodians, Laotians, and also what's happening today with refugees as well. You know, when I started doing research on refugees back in around 2015 and looking at the statistics from UNHCR, that's the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, there were about 50 to 60 million forcibly displaced people in the world and about 22 million or so refugees. Right now, that population of forcibly displaced people has grown to 103 million people, and the number of refugees is officially classified as 30.5 million. So I'm here to talk with Professor Yến Lê Espiritu, who's an expert on the topic. I've been following her work for a very long time, since the publication of her first book, 1993's Asian American Pan-Ethnicity. She's one of our country's leading scholars of Asian American studies. Her most recent book was 2014's Body Counts, the Vietnam War and Militarized Refugees, or militarized refugees, depending on how you read the title. So it's really an honor to talk to you, Professor Espiritu, because you've been my mentor, and like I said, your scholarship has been a big influence on my career. And we're going to talk a lot about refugees, but before we get to that, I'm kind of curious, you know, your work has recently turned more towards the Vietnam War and to refugees in general, but also to Vietnamese Americans and Vietnamese refugees. But why did you start off as a scholar of Asian Americans and Asian American studies?
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. And thank you, Philip, and thank you, Vic, for all of the work that you did to get us here this evening. And I just want to give a shout out to everyone who came to listen and watch us tonight from all over the world. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with all of you. So, Vic, thank you for the question. You know, I was thinking about this question when you sent it, and I guess my answer would be that I didn't write about Vietnamese refugees earlier because I didn't know how to. And the literature on refugees, it's vast, right? So if you look at refugees, there's so much that has been written, especially in my field of sociology. But this literature overwhelmingly conceptualizes refugees as a problem that to be solved, right? So you have so many studies about how to integrate refugee students educationally, how to assimilate them, how to get them jobs, how to address their mental health issues, and so on. And even at worst, how to keep them out, right? So I didn't want to contribute to that literature. I didn't want to replicate this production of Vietnamese refugees as a problem, but I didn't know how to do this. And until I know how, I didn't do it. And so my other field, of course, is Asian American studies. And in Asian American studies, the Vietnam War was prominent, but the Vietnamese refugees were not, right? So the Vietnam War is covered in Asian American study as a moment of political awakening for Asian Americans. And so, the Asian American movement was built in part on the anti-war efforts and the recognition of race, that Asian Americans had faces that looked like quote unquote the enemy. But the Vietnamese refugees as human beings, as displaced peoples, as fellow just like fellow travelers was not present. And I guess I also noticed that when Vietnamese refugees showed up, it was really in works that have to try to counter the model minority myth. So they would say, oh yeah, we have poor people, we have Vietnamese refugees and even more so Hmong and Cambodian Mien refugees. So therefore the model minority myth is a myth. And so we play that role. And again, that wasn't how I wanted to address refugees. So I guess I would say that the war in Iraq in 2003 gave me a way to write about Vietnamese refugees. Interestingly enough, it wasn't about conversation that I had with other refugees per se. And there were two things that I observed. One was that the extraordinary violence, the spectacle of war on Iraq and the Iraqi people. And at that moment, I recognized that this seemed familiar, like that this was something that we had seen before. And, if you remember back to 2003, the violence was covered like a sport, right? Like, oh, we had advanced, so many yards or whatever. And it wasn't, and the people in Iraq were missing, right? So it was just like there was this extraordinary violence, and yet the outcome of the violence wasn't central to this coverage. And so it reminded me of the coverage of the Vietnam War. And the second observation that I had was I'm in San Diego, and San Diego is one of the largest refugee resettlement areas in the country, and probably the largest in California. I saw Iraqi refugees coming. And so what I did was I connected US militarism and refugees. And so that was when I said, oh, I know how to talk about Vietnamese refugees. It was that I wanted to make the connection between militarism and migration and displacement. And the literature in the US, and there's two fields have been, usually are separated. So you have war studies and militarism studied by political scientists and so on, or you have refugee studied by sociologists and so on. So I think what I did was bringing these two fields together.
Thank you, Ji In, for taking us through the trajectory of your research and your work with respect to your own conceptualization of refugees from first getting involved in Asian American studies through your work on Asian American ethnicity, through your more recent work that centers refugees. For those of us who are joining us tonight, my name is Philip Nguyen, and I'm here with my co-host Viet Thanh Nguyen for Accented Dialogues and Diaspora, presented by the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network. And we are talking with Distinguished Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, San Diego, Yến Lê Espiritu. Yến, for the folks that, with respect to your work, and for the folks that might not know about how your own personal history and narrative might not know about you personally, right? In Asian American studies and ethnic studies, a lot of our motivations happen at the intersection between the political, policy-oriented, and the personal. Could you speak a little bit more about, we know that you were born in Vietnam and came to the United States as a refugee yourself. How much of that refugee experience would you say motivated or influenced your work?
Yes, like I think I started to answer that question with the first question, but I want to say something about what constitutes the refugee experience, because that's such a big kind of concept. And I wanted to just go back in time a little bit and to say that in 1975, I was a student at Duong High School in Vietnam in 7th grade. And and if you lived in Vietnam or know anything about the education system in Vietnam, it's extremely difficult. And so what I remember about the war, mostly one left an impression was that around February of 1975, I believe, the school was closed down. Like all of the schools were closed down. So as a consequence of the encroachment of the Vietnamese communists. But what I remember was that I was so relieved that this happened. And because school was so stressful, and it seemed like, oh, we get a break. And I mentioned this because I think that when people think about Vietnamese people and the war, they think that it's always like a constant presence, and it was, but there was and it was devastating. But there also were just really ordinary things that people still were very concerned about every day, like students worrying about their homework and feeling relieved that the war ended that pressure, for example. So we left a day or two before the fall of Saigon. So it was the first wave of Vietnamese refugees who left around April 1975. And I think that was significant in that we were a group of people who left before we really knew that South Vietnam was going to collapse. And it was, so I was very young at the time, but I don't know how many people really felt that we left for good, right? Like this was going to be the final goodbye. And it wasn't until we were in Guam, in Wuhan, when we learned in the news on April 30th that South Vietnam had indeed collapsed. And so I think that was the moment we became refugees, right? That is, a people without a country. And even at that age, I could sense the devastation, and even like the unexpected devastation that, hey, we're not going back. And I remember how quiet everything was, and it was in the evening, and I remember cigarette lights that dotted the tent city because people were in a very pensive mood. And so I think that's something very specific to the first wave refugees. And the second thing is that because we were the first wave, there was no infrastructure when we got here. There's like no little Saigon, right? No markets, no bookstores, no Paris by night, no restaurants, and so on. So it was a very, very lonely time. And I in Paris, so I did went to middle school and high school in Paris, California, P-E-R-R-I-S, in the inland. People would say, oh, Paris. No, it's Paris. And it was mostly Black and brown community. I was maybe one of two Asians in the school. So I guess I wanted to bring that up because that was my refugee experience. It was with other Black and brown folks. I learned more about race, about racism, about educational inequality, about economic injustice than I did about being refugee. Like for me, being refugee was being in this Black and brown and working class or even under working class community. And so my identity, I think, main for the first 5 years or so was as someone who didn't speak English. And so that identity continued to stay with me and makes me, like feel very anxious about events like today, because like, am I gonna, like that English is like, is it gonna happen today, or am I gonna not forget everything? So I think like,
I'm sorry.
oh no, I just mentioned that just to say that that was what I remember as being a refugee was, like the English part of it, and not necessarily about what I miss about Vietnam. There wasn't any time really to think about what you miss. Yeah, go ahead, Vic.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. I'm Viet Thanh Nguyen, one of your co-hosts, along with Philip Nguyen, my co-host. We're talking with Yến Lê Espiritu, Distinguished Professor of Ethnic Studies at UC San Diego, about the topic of refugees. And I just was really, really interested in hearing about your personal experiences, because I think my experience growing up in the Vietnamese refugee community is that everyone had a refugee story. I mean, there's very few people who didn't have these kinds of refugee stories, and each of them was unique in their own way. And when I hear your story, I wonder how difficult it might have been for you to become a scholar who was doing work around refugee issues, refugee experiences, refugee histories, when inevitably that kind of work brings out questions of trauma. On the one hand, in the United States, we're a society that's very much oriented towards trauma. There's all these reality shows where people are asked to talk about their trauma. There's all these memoirs about people dealing with their trauma. And for American veterans of the war, there was an entire diagnosis created for them, post-traumatic stress disorder. But within Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian communities, people who are refugees, it seems to me that the question of trauma was always something that was very difficult for people to grapple with. There was limited vocabulary, there was limited public options for speaking about this. Did you encounter this in your own research, and did you find it difficult to deal with that question of people's personal trauma as you're also trying to study the refugee experience?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I would say no, and I say no because once I was clear on what I wanted to write about, it was no longer, I didn't have the tension, and in part because I um I am not, I was not interested in reproducing trauma, or like trauma porn for someone else's consumption. So that wasn't necessarily the focus of the work. And instead, I wanted to think more about the Vietnamese refugee figure rather than Vietnamese people in that anthropological sense. Like I wasn't interested in thinking in documenting what Vietnamese people were experiencing per se, but rather to think about how those experiences allow us to think about the US militarism as a site of critique, and how refugee experiences provide us with a way to think about critical knowledge. So I um, once I was clear on what I wanted to write about, I think that I felt comfortable, and I was always clear that I wasn't going to write about anything about the community that outsider didn't deserve to know. So the boundary was very clear for me.
So in body counts, you conceptualize and come up with this field that is now known as critical refugee studies. And you kind of started to talk about it, the refugee figure as a site of critical knowledge, which has begun to attract a growing number of scholars, both Vietnamese, Southeast Asian, and non-Vietnamese and Southeast Asian. Could you speak a little bit more about what you mean by a critical refugee studies?
Yeah, so much of the discourse on refugee studies, as I say earlier, or just on refugees, tends to adopt like a state-driven approach, right? That views refugees either through a security lens or a source of threat. So critical refugees disrupts this myth of both like the Western rescue and liberation of refugees, and then makes visible the connections between refugee flight and Western intervention in third world countries. So the first intervention that critical refugee studies makes is to say that refugee is a site of political and social critique, like it's a site that opens up erased history, in particular that has to do with empire building, proxy wars, peacekeeping operations, and so on. And the second point of critical refugee studies is to be attentive to refugees as intentionalized beings. What are the desires and not only the needs, right, of the forcibly displaced? And how do we think about the improvised, the fluid, the alternative practices, the healing strategies that refugees produce on the run? And so, yeah, so that's different from thinking about refugee as a problem that needs to be solved.
You know, as I mentioned in the beginning, excuse me, as I mentioned in the beginning, Vietnamese refugees have always been here in the American consciousness, I think, in relationship to other kinds of refugees. So when I was at Fort India and Town Gap, the Vietnamese and Cambodian refugees were succeeded by the Cuban refugees. And so the way that refugees are often discussed in the United States, but also in other countries too, is oftentimes in relationship to other populations. Like there are good refugees, there are bad refugees, or there are people we want to welcome, and there are people we want to keep out. And it seems to me that in your thinking about critical refugee studies, you're also thinking critically exactly about that, the juxtaposition and the ways that certain refugees are valued and others are not. So how does the field of critical refugee studies allow us to think about the connections between one population of refugees and another population of refugees?
Yes, thank you for that question. I think about the layering, right, of different kinds of power structures and the radical kinship that can be forged with other displaced or removed peoples. And as the example that I showed earlier about the Iraq War and the plight of the Iraqi people jolted me or clarified for me the stakes of the Vietnam War and for the Vietnamese people. So one point that I make in the book is that you can't ever really erase history. This history is going to surface along, not necessarily from your own community, but it can surface through other communities or through kin communities. So I think about the war in Syria as well, and the Syrian people, the Syrian boat people. That experience really also jolted Vietnamese people to recollect their experiences as boat people, and as I understand it launched conversations with the second generation among Vietnamese people about the boat experience that many parents have hidden from their children. And so again, those erased histories can surface because the histories are repeated, and they allow us to recognize each other as historical beings, as this history repeats.
Thank you for that, Duong. And for those of you who are joining us, this is Philip Nguyen. I'm here with my co-host, Viet Thanh Nguyen, and we're speaking with UCSD Distinguished Professor of Ethnic Studies, Yến Lê Espiritu, on refugees. Duong, so you mentioned about the second generation and this tension that exists between the children of those who are refugees and their parents. And we also want to be able to talk about this new book that has come out that you worked on with the Critical Refugee Studies Collective. I think in the introduction, you evoke Audre Lorde's notion of genuine change without using the master's tools. For those of us who are listening in on this radio show, this podcast, for the second generation, what types of tools would they be able to get to not sort of re-perpetuate these cycles of trauma, tension, hardship that we have been so familiar with in our upbringing as children of refugees? Could you speak a little bit to the generation after?
Yes. What maybe the first thing I would say is I was listening to Ocean Vuong, one of the interviews that he did recently, and one thing that he says is that no one accidentally survives, and I should think that that's such a powerful way of thinking for the second generation to think about the experiences of the first generation. Is how much work, creativity, determination, sheer courage, and on that brought, that enabled their family to come and for them to now exist in this way. So I think just to keep in mind the vast the amount of experiences that and the work that required for the first generation to get here, I think is really important. And the second generation, I have a lot of hope because there's so much that is available for them now, like, like Divine and one of the amazing Vietnamese authors out there, like poet Lang Yun, for example. There's so many resources for them to be able to engage differently from, say, people who came in, much earlier in 1975. So go out there and explore and enjoy and engage.
To wrap things up with our guest, Professor Yến Lê Espiritu, I have a question that might be a little personal. I go around the country giving talks about refugee experiences, and I oftentimes start off by saying I'm a refugee, not in the past tense, but in the present tense, even though technically I'm not a refugee anymore. I don't look like one. I'm 40 years removed from the refugee experience. But in some ways, I still feel psychologically and emotionally attached to my refugee history and my refugee experience. And I feel the need to call myself a refugee in the present tense, also to stand up with other refugees as well, and not to deny my refugee present or my refugee past, because it seems to me that a lot of refugees deliberately or unintentionally call themselves something else besides refugees, call themselves immigrants, for example. I'm wondering, in your own experience, do you still feel like a refugee? Do you call yourself a refugee in the present tense, or is it all past tense for you?
Oh, I definitely see myself as a refugee, and I'm super proud now of having of being able to have this experience and being able to name myself as a refugee. So I can say more, but yeah, definitely to answer your question. And I very strongly identify as Vietnamese and so proud of being Vietnamese. Shout out for any Vietnamese in the audience. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's a great note to end on. Proud of being a Vietnamese, proud of being a refugee. And it's
Just
been my
because,
pleasure
as
to
I
be
say, there's so much that we need to do to make it, and not make it in the neoliberal sense, but just make it, meaning being able to show up for each other, creating community for each other, maintaining our history, and being able to keep this Vietnamese-ness against a lot of pressure. I think I'm super proud of that.
Thank you so much, Professor Yến Lê Espiritu, for speaking with me and with Philip Nguyen on this topic of refugees on Accented Dialogues in Diaspora. It's been such a pleasure. DJ Puzzle, take us out.
Thank you.